Welcome back to Mystery Con. Today I'll be narrating one of the most chilling government conspiracies ever whispered. 12 US military personnel vanished. No funerals, no headlines. They didn't go rogue, they left Earth. Only 8 returned. And what they brought back wasn't just stories. Before we begin, like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. Let's get into Project Serpo. In 1965, 12 Americans vanished from official records. They didn't die, they didn't defect. They left Earth on a mission no one was supposed to remember. That's where it begins. Not in a headline or a documentary, but in a classified memo buried so deep it never had a title, just a date and a status. Reassigned. Non-terrestrial. Before the message boards lit up, before whispers turned into theories, there was only static. Background noise, the kind of thing most people ignore. But if you've spent enough time watching how the government hides things, you learn to recognize the outline of something real by the shape of its absence. I came across Serpo the same way a paleontologist finds fossils, by accident, and then with obsession. Back then, it wasn't even called that. Just a number on a file I wasn't supposed to see. 092565. I was working on a clearance audit on Cold War flight telemetry and came across the anomaly, 12 personnel listed under a transfer operation that didn't match any known launch, exercise, or mission. No corresponding manifest, no return date, just 12 names and the word sealed. I flagged it, made a note, and moved on. But it never left me. In the years that followed, that number kept surfacing, once in a deprecated communications log from Holloman Air Force Base, and again in an index of non-standard medical files linked to Wright-Patterson. Each time it was associated with different departments, different code names, but the same, recurring thread, a mission that shouldn't exist. Then in late 2005, something changed. An obscure researcher's website, mostly known for chasing down FOIA releases on the Roswell incident, published a set of anonymous emails. The sender claimed to be a retired Defense Intelligence employee. The topic? A secret government program called Project Serpo. According to the emails, 12 military personnel, 10 men, 2 women, were selected in the early 1960s to travel to a planet in the Zeta Reticuli system. Their mission, peaceful exchange with an extraterrestrial species referred to as the Ebons. The return was scheduled for 1978, only 8 came back. The emails were detailed, more than they should have been. They included star charts, atmospheric descriptions, gravity metrics, biological summaries, data that didn't seem like it was pulled from fiction. They also included names, real ones, and some of those names matched classified personnel rosters I'd encountered years earlier during a declassification stint with the National Reconnaissance Office. That's when I started looking harder. It didn't take long to realize the backlash had already been engineered. Every post about Serpo was quickly buried under ridicule. The few forums that took it seriously were flooded with contradicting insider accounts. The classic playbook. Flood the zone with confusion. Turn a signal into noise. But amid the disinformation, some things stayed consistent. The number of travelers, the year of departure, and one odd phrase that kept repeating. Time ran differently there. I started comparing the Serpo documents to historical data, sets, radiation exposure protocols, weight loss metrics in long-duration isolation experiments, even memos on altered circadian rhythms from early space flights. And buried deep in one of those files I found a health summary. It was redacted beyond recognition, but one field stood out. It was listed in a unit that didn't make sense. Chronological impact ratio, measured in units of 1.24.1. I kept digging. I shouldn't have. But curiosity turns into duty when the pieces begin to fit. A decade of scattered hints began to form a shape. 6 officers unaccounted for between 1964 and 1966. A cancelled mission to the moon that was never publicly announced. A construction budget for a deep transfer vehicle that was classified under agricultural research. And always, in the background, silence. The kind that feels intentional. You start to see a pattern. The military blacked out the windows, sure, but the light still got through in slivers. I don't know if everything in those emails was true. I doubt it, but I know this much. The idea of Project Serpo didn't come from nowhere. There are too many alignments, too many buried files, too many things that simply don't erase cleanly. It wasn't just a story, it was a message, a breadcrumb trail for those still paying attention. And I've followed that trail farther than I probably should. This isn't about little green men or flying saucers. It's about agreements, decisions made in hidden rooms by people we never elected. It's about the possibility that during the Cold War, while the world watched 2 superpowers fight for dominance, a third party quietly entered the conversation. And we answered. Not with fear, but with cooperation, with an exchange. Serpo isn't a legend, it's a ledger. A record of 12 people who stepped into the unknown, and 8 who came back, changed. They said it was a hoax, but what if it wasn't? It was a quiet afternoon in November 2005 when the message first appeared. I remember, because I wasn't looking for anything unusual that day. I was scrolling through archived posts on a small UFO research forum, mostly out of habit. It was a space for people like me, those who still paid attention to details most people overlooked. Among the usual chatter and recycled sightings, one thread stood out. Its title was plain, Information Regarding Project Serpo, Eyes Only. No one had replied to it. There were no views, just a wall of text copied from an email someone claimed to have received from a retired government worker. I opened it out of curiosity. I kept reading because it didn't sound like a story. It sounded like a report. The message described a secret program that began in the 1960s. It said 12 US military personnel had left Earth in July of 1965. They traveled to a planet far beyond our solar system in a spacecraft provided by visitors who had first made contact in the late 1940s. The program, it claimed, had been organized under a classified agreement. The travelers stayed for 13 years before 8 of them returned in 1978. 2 had died and 2 had chosen to remain behind. The email didn't try to sound dramatic. It wasn't filled with emotion. It read like someone trying to explain something they had carried for too long. At first, it was hard to take seriously. The claims were too big. But as I kept reading, I saw something different. The details were steady. The story didn't shift. It included names, ranks, locations, and exact dates. Most of the names were redacted, but a few weren't. I recognized one of them, a colonel. whose records I had seen years earlier during a routine personnel audit. His file ended in 1965, with no reason given for his reassignment, no transfer, no retirement, no death certificate, just a closed record. Within a week, more emails followed. Each one added new details, logs, mission outlines, summaries of training exercises, and even descriptions of the alien planet. The sender didn't ask for attention or donations. He didn't sell books. He claimed he was part of the debriefing team that met the travelers when they returned. He said he had kept silent for almost 30 years, but decided it was time to share what he knew. The first email had been sent to a man named Victor, who ran a small civilian research group focused on extraterrestrial contact. Victor posted it online, not knowing it would start something larger than he could control. At first, only a few people noticed, but it didn't take long for the emails to spread. Copies were shared across forums, reposted on websites, and translated into multiple languages. As the reach grew, so did the resistance. Some claimed the emails were a hoax, pointing to minor inconsistencies in the story. Others said it was a psychological operation designed to spread confusion. A few believed it completely. What made it difficult to dismiss, though, was how specific it all was. The planet, called Serpo, was described in terms that matched actual star system data, details about Zeta Reticuli that hadn't been commonly known in 2005. The information about gravity, day length, and atmosphere matched what modern simulations would later confirm about a planet in that system. As the noise grew louder, I stayed focused on the details. I created a timeline of the claims. I listed each of the 12 supposed participants and compared them to known military records. Every time a name matched a person who disappeared from the public system in the mid-60s, my doubt faded a little more. I wasn't the only one digging. A few quiet researchers began comparing the emails to known events, test flights, satellite launches, even budget requests that had gone unexplained in that era. Slowly, a pattern began to take shape. The deeper I went, the more I realized something had been buried, not just by secrecy, but by design. One detail stuck with me. The emails said the visitors first made contact after a crash in New Mexico. That part wasn't new. Stories of a crash in 1947 had been around for decades, but this one claimed the visitors weren't stranded. They were on purpose. According to the messages, the crash wasn't an accident. It was the start of a test, an invitation, not a disaster. One of the survivors supposedly lived for 5 years under military watch. He taught our people basic communication, offered technical knowledge, and explained where he had come from. When he died, he left behind a device. It was a kind of locator beacon, but not one used to call for help. It was a timer. When it reached 0, a second ship arrived. That ship brought the offer. 12 people, 1 mission, a 13-year exchange. The idea that we had agreed to something so massive, so far-reaching, and managed to hide it for decades seemed impossible. But the evidence wasn't loud. It was quiet, subtle, just out of reach, but still there if you looked hard enough. I remembered how some records had gone missing during my early years of clearance work. Whole missions with blanked-out pages, not redacted, removed, gone without explanation. At the time I thought it was poor record-keeping. Now I wondered if those gaps were part of something much larger. I tried to verify as much as I could. The training location mentioned in the emails, an underground facility in the Nevada desert, matched descriptions from other unrelated files I'd seen. The timelines lined up with periods of high-budget military spending that couldn't be explained by any public project. The technology mentioned in the emails, energy sources, materials, medical methods, all sounded just plausible enough, not futuristic, just unfamiliar. By the end of the year, the messages stopped. No more updates, no more emails. The original account disappeared. The man who ran the forum where they had first been posted shut down his site within weeks. He never explained why. When asked, he simply said the situation had gotten too complicated. His phone number was disconnected. His last known address was empty. I never found out what happened to him, but the messages were still out there. And the more I studied them, the more I understood what made them different. They didn't try to convince, they just told the story. Whoever sent them didn't care if they were believed. He only cared that the story existed somewhere, outside the vault, beyond the redactions. Something to outlive silence. That's when I knew I couldn't look away. If even a fraction of it was real, it meant we had sent people to another world. It meant they had walked on alien soil, seen things we could barely imagine, and came back changed. It meant we had lied to the public for 50 years, not to protect them, but to protect the secret. And it meant the next question wasn't if the story was true, it was why it was hidden in the first place. It took time to figure out where to start. The emails had stopped, the sender was silent, and the source forum had gone dark. But buried in one of the early messages was a clue I hadn't noticed at first, a reference to a name that didn't belong. It wasn't part of the known personnel involved in the Serpo account, and it wasn't a military designation. It was just a name, Whitmore. No rank, no title, just that. At first, I thought it might be a mistake or red herring, but something about it stuck with me. I ran the name through a few open databases and found nothing helpful. Then I cross-referenced it with declassified government correspondence from the mid-60s. That's when something interesting surfaced. Dr. Raymond Whitmore had been listed as a civilian science advisor on a 1964 Joint Air Force and Department of Energy project based out of southern New Mexico. The project's description was vague, something about atmospheric boundary testing, but the location matched a classified range I had seen mentioned in the earlier Serpo messages. It was the first real overlap between the public record and the contents of the emails. I wanted more, so I started digging into the project's funding requests. Hidden in the appropriations forms was an unusual item, $12.6 million earmarked for off-world biology support infrastructure. That phrase didn't belong anywhere in a 1964 budget request. It was the kind of wording that didn't slip through unless someone didn't know what they were reading, and somehow it made it into the final copy. That was the moment the story became more than just theory. I found more as I traced Whitmore's trail. He left the program in late 1965, citing health reasons. But no retirement paperwork followed, no pension, no forwarding address. It was as if he'd stepped off the grid entirely. Yet 8 months later, a file under his name was attached to a review panel evaluating exotic material samples that had been acquired in cooperation with non-standard aerospace entities. That phrase was unfamiliar, so I checked the footnotes. It led to a short list of organizations operating under a branch I had never heard of, something called Group 6 integration, tied loosely to the Office of National Reconnaissance. At first I thought it might have been a misfile, but the structure and metadata suggested it wasn't just real, it was active well into the 1980s. That was when I realized I needed to go back to the source of the story, the very beginning. The messages had mentioned Zeta Reticuli as the home system of the visitors. That alone was easy to dismiss until I remembered something else. In 1961, a couple named Betty and Barney Hill claimed they had been abducted by strange beings. Under hypnosis, Betty described a star map she claimed had been shown to her. Years later, an amateur astronomer recreated that map. It matched Zeta Reticuli, two stars bound together in a binary system. At the time, no one took it seriously. But now I wondered, if the Serpo messages were built on existing stories, why add details that could later be verified? Why tie it to obscure cases that only a few would recognize, unless the stories had a common root, unless someone was testing the edges of memory? I found another thread worth pulling. In the late 1980s, a small group of researchers gained access to old Air Force rosters under a pilot transparency program. One document listed Project Crystal Night with 12 names blacked out. It was the same year count as the Serpo team. The date, July 1965. The project description, long-range personnel deployment under foreign custody agreement. I had never seen the phrase foreign custody used that way. In every military context it referred to personnel detained or transferred to Allied forces, but this document had no country code, no reciprocal partner, and no point of contact, just a start date and a status, operational. I traced the document's origin and found it had come from a now dissolved command post near Holloman Air Force Base, the very place the Serpo messages said the exchange had taken place. It was all circumstantial, but together it was too close to ignore. I kept my findings organized in a private archive, every file, every detail, every timeline cross-checked. I wasn't trying to convince anyone. I just needed to understand what I was looking at. But the more I gathered, the more I started to notice something strange. Some of the forums where I had first found pieces of this story were shutting down. Not all at once, and not with any public reason, but the same pattern repeated. Threads disappeared, admins stopped posting, user lists were wiped. When I checked a backup of one forum, I saw that several posts about Serpo had been edited retroactively. Dates changed, phrases missing, whole sections overwritten with placeholder text. It was being erased slowly, deliberately, and without notice. I began checking deeper, using offline copies, archived snapshots, anything I could find. The more I compared, the clearer it became. Someone didn't want the pieces visible in one place. They didn't remove everything, just enough to muddy the trail. I started to wonder how much time I had before someone noticed my own research. I kept it offline, encrypted, and backed up on isolated drives. But even that didn't feel secure. I'd seen this before. Quiet suppression, not loud. Censorship. No threats, no warnings, just silence, edits, disappearances. I remembered what the original sender wrote in his first message. I'm sharing this now because I may not have another chance. If they don't stop me, they'll bury it anyway. That sentence echoed in my mind as I looked over the files I had gathered. I hadn't proven anything yet, but I had verified enough to know the core of the story wasn't fiction. The names, the dates, the project numbers, they didn't line up by accident. Someone had built a structure to keep this hidden, and someone else had left the cracks for people like me to find. It wasn't about proving Serpo existed. It was about understanding why it was hidden so well and for so long. Not because people wouldn't believe it, but because some already did. The deeper I went, the more resistance I began to feel. Not from people, I had learned to work alone, but from something quieter, more deliberate. The first sign came when I tried to revisit one of the government databases I'd accessed earlier in my search. It was a restricted portal, but my clearance, history from years of service had always given me limited read-only access. That day, it didn't. My credentials failed, not once, but 3 times, and each time I was locked out faster than before. An error message appeared, one I hadn't seen in years. Query denied, user privileges revoked. I checked my local archive, cross-referenced old access logs, and confirmed that nothing had changed on my end. That meant the change had come from outside. Quietly, without notice, someone had shut a door I'd been allowed to open for years. I didn't panic. I knew better than to react. Instead, I started paying closer attention to what was happening around me. I stopped using my personal email for anything related to the research. I kept the Serpo material on an encrypted offline drive stored inside a small Faraday cage in my office. I used burner devices, kept my internet activity limited, and operated as if I were already being watched. And then something else happened. Something that confirmed I was no longer imagining things. A researcher I had been in contact with, someone named Thomas who had followed the Serpo trail even longer than I had, suddenly disappeared from our usual channels. He'd been sending me updates every week, small leads, old photos, comments, from people who had once served on radar stations in the southwest. Then one day, he just stopped replying. At first, I assumed he had lost interest or moved on. But I waited. A week passed. Then another. I sent a brief, harmless message to a backup account we'd agreed to use only in emergencies. No response. When I searched for his online presence, everything was gone. His profile was deleted, his archived posts removed, and a public blog he'd maintained for over a decade had been taken down completely. Not hidden, not locked, erased. The domain was now a broken link. I checked public records. No obituary, no missing persons report, no employment listings. He had vanished without a trace. That was the moment the tension became real. It's one thing to uncover secrets, it's another to realize someone is watching the ones who do. From that point forward, I worked under a different set of rules. I moved apartments without listing a change of address. I used separate physical locations for storing different parts of the archive. I no longer connected certain devices to the internet at all. I told no one what I was doing. The isolation was sharp, but necessary. I needed to understand what I was up against, and that meant moving without leaving footprints. Then came the phone call. It happened on a Tuesday night. The number was blocked. I didn't answer. A voicemail appeared, only 5 seconds long. No words. Just silence, followed by the faint click of a receiver hanging up. That same night, my internet went down for 4 hours without explanation. When it returned, my router settings had been reset to factory defaults. All logs wiped. I replaced the hardware the next day. These weren't coincidences, they were pressure points, small reminders that someone was aware of what I was doing. But they weren't direct enough to stop me. That was the pattern. Pressure, without confrontation, the kind of tactics meant to wear someone down over time. I understood it well. I had seen similar methods used during counterintelligence operations years ago. Subtle, deniable, but always present. Enough to make someone question their memory. Enough to suggest, without saying it, that you're not alone. I didn't stop. If anything, I went deeper. That's when I came across the reference to a group, known only as Executive Subcommittee 9. It was mentioned once in a handwritten margin note on a photocopied report buried in a Cold War archive. The report had nothing to do with aliens or Serpo. It was about foreign psychological operations. But that note, written in a rushed, slanted script, said, "Forward to ESC-9 per standing protocol." I didn't know what ESC-9 was, but I found the same phrase again a few weeks later, in a redacted memo from the Defense Intelligence Archive, dated 1974. That one listed a series of document recipients by coded initials. ESC-9 was the last on the list. The message ended with a short sentence, "Serpo status, return phase active." That was enough to confirm the link. Whatever ESC-9 was, they weren't a division or a task force. They were something smaller, more discreet, a gatekeeper. I followed the trail through obscure procurement contracts, black budget reporting lines, and technical oversight boards. All of them led to small, unnamed clusters of analysts and advisors embedded in larger agencies, always off the books, always unlisted. ESC-9, it turned out, was not a team but a designation. A rotating subcommittee tasked with reviewing cases marked OEA, Other Entity Agreements. There was no public record of this label. I only found it because a single budget line in 1982 had used it without masking the acronym. It had appeared under a section of a defense review marked Non-Standard Liaison Programs. The more I searched, the clearer the structure became. The government didn't hide Serpo by locking it in a single vault. They hid it in plain sight, spread across dozens of compartments, each with just enough information to function, but never enough to understand the whole. A need-to-know maze built not for secrecy, but for confusion. Even insiders couldn't see the full picture unless they knew exactly where to look. That's how you protect something big, by making it too complex to follow. But someone was watching. The watchers, and whoever they were, they had decided that the trail needed to end. The shutdowns, the disappearances, the pressure, it all pointed to one thing, not a system protecting national security, a group protecting control. They weren't working to protect the public from panic, they were working to protect themselves from exposure. The Serpo story wasn't just about contact, it was about trust. Somewhere along the way, someone made a deal they couldn't explain, and now every effort to uncover it was treated as a threat, not to the nation, but to those who had hidden it. That's when I realized I wasn't searching for aliens anymore. I was searching for the people who didn't want us to know we'd already met them. It was through a quiet, unmarked lead that I met the man who finally confirmed what I had only suspected. He wasn't someone I approached directly. He came to me, though not in person at first. It started with a simple note left in my mailbox, no stamp, no envelope, just a folded sheet of paper with one sentence: "You're not the only one still looking." I lived in a building with secure access and had no listed address tied to my research. That meant whoever left the note knew exactly where I was and exactly what I was doing. The writing was clean, printed in block letters, no signature. I checked my hallway cameras. The feed had cut out for 3 minutes sometime in the early morning hours, long enough for someone to get in, leave the note, and disappear. I waited 3 days before anything else happened. Then a second note arrived, this time slid under my door. It contained a location, a date, and a time, an empty parking structure on the edge of town, 2 levels below street access, 9 p.m. sharp. I considered ignoring it. I had reason to be cautious, but something about the timing and the precision told me this wasn't a trap. Whoever this person was, they weren't trying to scare me. They wanted to be heard. So I went. I arrived early and waited in my car. The place was quiet, the kind of dead silence you only find in places built to be forgotten. At 9 exactly, a car pulled in 3 spaces away. An older man stepped out, grey hair, pressed jacket, no expression. He walked over slowly, hands visible, posture calm. I didn't speak. He did. He said his name wasn't important. What mattered, he said, was that he had seen the files, real files, the kind that never made it to digital archives. He had worked in a division that didn't exist on any flowchart, part of an internal audit team assigned to review cold storage records from deep black programs in the early 2000s. According to him, one of those files was marked 12 volunteers. Project 731 Serpo, outcome mixed. He said the file was thin, just 47 pages, most of it typed summaries with attached handwritten annotations. But the parts that remained were clear enough. The program was real. The names of the personnel matched the ones I had already verified through public disappearance records. The departure location was listed as Holloman Air Force Base. The launch date was July 16, 1965, and the purpose of the mission was listed as Cooperative Species Observation, Long-Term Exchange. I asked him why he was telling me this now. He said something had shifted in recent months. New access restrictions were going into effect, entire floors being sealed off, physical documents being pulled from cold storage and transferred into facilities with no known designation. He said it was happening fast and without explanation. That was why he reached out. He didn't know how long he would have access or how long his memory would stay clear. He handed me a flash drive, not stolen files, he said, but notes. His own notes, typed over several years, cross-referenced against internal indexes and retention schedules. The flash drive also contained scans of 2 documents. One was a medical observation form titled Subject Return, Cognitive Displacement, Report. The second was a map, not of Earth, but a layout of a structure labeled as Ebon Habitat Landing Interface. It showed a central hub, 4 adjoining corridors, and something labeled Containment Access. The lines were clean. The symbols were unlike anything I had seen. He said it had come from a briefing binder that was supposed to be destroyed, but somehow had been misfiled. I asked him what happened to the rest of the crew, the ones who returned. He paused for a long time before answering. He said they had been kept in isolation for nearly a year after their return. He wasn't part of that process, but he had read summaries. Most had adjusted poorly. One refused to speak for weeks. Another developed a rare neurological disorder with no known origin. 2 were placed under indefinite psychological observation. Their records had been sealed, their families told they had been reassigned or medically retired. Only one of them, he said, had shown signs of clear memory and emotional stability. That person was debriefed extensively and then disappeared from all formal documentation. I asked if any of them were still alive. He said he believed, at least, one was, though he hadn't seen confirmation. I asked for names. He didn't have any. All references were replaced with initials or numeric codes. I didn't expect more. Even this much was more than I'd hoped for. I thanked him, and he nodded, then walked back to his car without another word. I never saw him again. When I got home, I reviewed the contents of the flash drive. His notes were meticulous. They matched several points I had already uncovered, but went deeper. He had charted a timeline of interactions between different departments, noting which agencies had been tasked with containment and which had only been informed after the fact. He believed the exchange had been proposed by the Ebons themselves, not as a gift or demand, but as part of an existing system. In his words, they had done this before, with others. That line changed everything. If true, it meant Serpo wasn't unique. It meant other worlds, other programs, possibly other species, had participated in similar exchanges. That might explain the strange urgency behind the suppression efforts. It wasn't just about hiding what we did, it was about hiding what we had joined. The files also suggested something else. A section of the notes outlined the training process the 12 had undergone before departure. The program lasted nearly a year. It included survival instruction, stress inoculation, basics, language decoding, and even dietary adaptation. They were told to prepare for prolonged separation from Earth, and that return was not guaranteed. They signed waivers, not with names, but with biometric codes. Their departure was scheduled to coincide with the arrival of an incoming vessel that had already made a similar journey before, empty, automated, a test run. The man's notes ended with a simple observation. He wrote, "They didn't send them to explore, they sent them to be observed." That sentence stayed with me. It echoed in everything I had uncovered so far. The secrecy, the silence, the psychological damage, it all pointed to a deeper truth. Serpo wasn't just a scientific mission. It was a test of something more fundamental. Trust, behavior, perhaps even compatibility. We hadn't just stepped into their world. We had agreed to be studied by it. And from what I was starting to gather, the results were far more complicated than anyone had expected. The first true confirmation came unexpectedly. It didn't arrive through a classified leak or some coded message. It came from an old document that had been buried in a university archive, misfiled in a box of unrelated aerospace engineering material. I had been following a lead about retired contractors who had once worked near Holloman Air Force Base in the 1970s. One of them had donated a personal collection of technical papers and journals to a small state college before he died. I requested access and spent 3 days combing through engineering diagrams and fuel system schematics. Most of it was dull, expected material, until I opened a notebook labeled simply ELS Journal. The handwriting was precise, dated, page by page, and there were no references to any known aerospace project. One page in particular stood out. It described a transport craft arriving at a desert landing site in July 1965. The entry noted the craft's strange shape. its lack of visible propulsion, and a notable heat shimmer that surrounded it even while stationary. But it was what came next that changed everything. The following entry, dated the same night, described a controlled boarding process involving 12 uniformed personnel, each carrying lightweight packs and wearing suits lined with what the writer called bioadaptive fibers. The writer didn't name the mission or its purpose, but he did use a 3-letter designation, SRP, which was followed by a dash and the number 12. The next page detailed visual observations of the craft lifting off at a slow, silent angle before disappearing into the upper atmosphere. The final line of the entry read, "Return planned in 1978. No contact allowed before then. Orders final." I checked the author's name. It matched the donor of the collection, a former propulsion systems technician with joint clearance to Air Force and Department of Energy research operations. He had never spoken publicly about his work. His records showed nothing unusual, but here in his private notes, he had described exactly what the Serpo files had claimed for years. I made high-resolution scans of every page and brought them home for review. That night I read them twice, then cross-checked them against the flash drive notes I had received weeks earlier. The handwriting described the same date, the same departure site, and the same number of personnel. The suits were mentioned in both accounts. The date of return was identical. These weren't coincidences. They were observations from someone who had witnessed the launch firsthand. The realization was overwhelming. For the first time, I had a source outside the internet rumors, outside the message threads and anonymous leaks. This was a physical journal written by a man who had no public interest in conspiracy, no reason to lie, and no indication that he had even been aware of the wider Serpo narrative. That kind of unconnected confirmation is rare. It either means a hoaxer was lucky, beyond reason, or that the truth had simply been scattered so wide and so deep that parts of it had survived by accident. I needed to be sure. So I tracked down the technician's surviving family. He had one daughter, now in her 50s, living in Arizona. I approached her carefully, asked only about her father's work and what she remembered from those years. She said he was gone for long stretches, but never talked about his job. He told her once, when she was young, that he had seen something that didn't fit into the world people believed in. When she asked what it was, he said, "Something you couldn't explain even if you wanted to." That was all she remembered. I didn't press further. I didn't mention the journal. I didn't need to. I had what I came for. Back at home, I began organizing everything I had confirmed. The journal provided the timeline, the flash drive offered context, the government files confirmed budgetary alignment, and now, with all three, the outline of the story became clear. The mission had happened, the departure had been witnessed, the 12 had been real. What remained unclear was what happened once they arrived. That question was answered a week later when a file surfaced online for just under 6 hours before. Being removed, it was posted to a small server operated by a now-defunct academic group once interested in recovered space telemetry. The file claimed to be an excerpt from a debrief report, specifically a personal log from one of the returned crew members. The language was clinical, precise, but human. It described the descent to the surface of a planet with 2 suns. The sky was described as a pale yellow, and the land as dry, rocky, but dotted with green growth near settlements. The log mentioned a reception ceremony, peaceful, quiet, and organized. The The beings, referred to only as hosts, communicated through both sound and subtle gestures. There was no fear in the log's tone, only observation. One passage described walking through a settlement made of structures shaped like arcs, built from smooth matte materials that changed temperature with the weather. Another noted the presence of a central tower used for what the writer called energy exchange and coordination. The most striking entry, dated day 14, stated simply, "Time moves differently here. Our internal clocks and watches are already unsynchronized. What feels like hours to us reads as days on the monitors. We've been warned not to rely on Earth-based rhythms." That entry confirmed a core element of the Serpo narrative, time dilation. Not in the way physics explains it from high speed travel, but something environmental, as if the planet itself affected perception. The log ended abruptly with a notation that all communication would be suspended during the next phase of the mission. It was signed only with the letter M, and the file was labeled Serpo log M02. I saved it immediately, but when I returned to the page 10 minutes later, the entire server was offline. The domain was soon listed as available for purchase. I attempted to trace the IP history, but it led only to an offshore registrar known for temporary hosting. There was no way to confirm the source, but the log's tone and detail matched the pattern I had come to recognize. Factual, plain, and without exaggeration. The writer hadn't tried to convince anyone. He had simply recorded what he experienced. With that log, something inside me shifted. I had spent years chasing shadows, piecing together timelines, following scraps of hidden history. But now, for the first time, I had something living, words from someone who had stood on another world and seen what we were never supposed to see. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a record. It was history that had been erased and buried, but not destroyed. And now I wasn't just researching it, I was holding it. The journal entry that mentioned the planet's 2 suns and the altered passage of time had stayed with me for days, but it was a second, lesser-known document that led me to one of the most significant and unsettling pieces of the story, the death of one of the 12. It came from a hard-to-find file labeled as Environmental Incident Log, Phase 1, preserved only in a partially redacted state on a military contractor's obsolete server. The document wasn't long. It listed medical observations, chronological markers, and coded references to internal crew designations. But among the clinical data and vague terms, one phrase stood out. Subject 05. System failure following. Initial integration. The report went on to describe severe physiological stress, unexplained immune collapse, and something referred to as cellular incompatibility. The document didn't name the subject, but it noted that he had survived for only 6 Earth days after arrival and was buried on the alien world with a brief ceremony conducted by both crew and host entities. The loss wasn't explained. There was no indication of what triggered the decline, no trace of infection or trauma. The medical section ended with a stark summary. Protocol insufficient. Biologic mismatch suspected. Autopsy not permitted by host species. That last line disturbed me more than anything else. Not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. That the hosts, while welcoming and cooperative, had limits. Limits we hadn't anticipated. I compared the incident timeline with earlier crew training notes and found something curious. According to the preparation logs, the crew had been monitored for compatibility against environmental samples collected during initial contact visits, but the data had gaps. 3 entries were marked as probable, not confirmed. Subject 05 was one of those 3. This meant the decision to include him had been made despite some risk. Either the team believed the symptoms would be manageable, or someone decided the odds were acceptable. That kind of risk pointed to urgency. It meant the mission may not have been as voluntary as the public story implied. I searched further and found a second reference to Subject 05 in a file labeled Field Journal Segment, Emotional Impact. It was handwritten, transcribed into a typed format years later, and signed with the same single initial as the earlier logs, M. This entry was different from the rest. It was personal, fragmented, written in a tone that suggested fatigue and grief. The author described the crew's reaction to the loss, the sudden shift in morale, and the realization that the planet's atmosphere, while breathable, wasn't entirely compatible with every member of the team. The entry stated, "We thought the hardest part would be communication, or the distance from home. It wasn't. It was watching one of our own fail right in front of us. The hosts did everything they could, so did we, but it didn't matter." That line lingered. It added a layer of human weight to a story that had so far been told in quiet, mechanical terms. This wasn't just an experiment or a mission. These were people, each carrying the burden of representing an entire species, and now facing the reality that they could die out there without answers, without closure, and without even the basic dignity of understanding what went wrong. The writer continued, "His name was left off the summary list. I don't know why. Maybe they didn't want the record to show a failure, but we remember him. We said his name aloud at the end. We said it so we wouldn't forget." That was the moment. The story became irreversible for me. This wasn't fiction. It wasn't theory. It was a record of something real, something lived. The kind of detail that couldn't be faked. Not like that. Not with that weight. I checked the crew list. I had built over the years. 11 names had been verified. 1 name had always been missing. Now I understood why. The omission wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a way to preserve the illusion of success. 12 went, 8 returned, 2 stayed, 1 died, and 1 was erased. I wanted to know more. I looked for medical files, psychological summaries, even just a passing mention in supply manifests or rosters, but nothing surfaced. Subject 05 had been removed so completely that the only remaining trace was in a journal entry never meant to be public. I contacted a source I hadn't spoken to in months, a former technician who had worked briefly at the same site where the crew had reportedly trained. I asked if he remembered any early incident, anything unusual, perhaps a shift in schedule or a change in the team's lineup. He paused before answering. Then he said, "I remember there was someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Younger than the rest. Not career military. Some kind of civilian attachment. He only lasted a few weeks in training before he disappeared. No explanation. We assumed he was cut from the program, but maybe he wasn't." That detail matched the limited records I had uncovered. One of the initial trainees had been added late in the process. He was not on the final clearance manifest. but now I believed he had gone anyway. Perhaps out of necessity. Perhaps because something had gone wrong in the original selection process. That would explain the incomplete compatibility test, the medical uncertainty, and the eventual silence. He hadn't just died, he had been removed from history before the mission even began. I looked again at the burial note in the incident report. It stated, interment, coordinated with host guidance, cation marked, acknowledgement conducted per joint protocol. It was formal, careful, and sterile. But buried in it was a line that said more than the rest. Stone placed with personal symbol provided by subject prior to departure. That meant he knew, or at least suspected. He had left something behind, something meant to last longer than him. A symbol placed in alien soil under a double sun, left by a man whose name the world never learned. I closed the file and sat with that thought for a long time. The idea that a single person could be sent across the stars, lost to the world, remembered only by the quiet marks of a mission that never officially happened. His name was gone, but his story wasn't. It was written in the blank spaces, in the silences, in the lines that no one was supposed to see. And now that I had read them, I couldn't forget. After confirming the burial of the lost crew member and the quiet grief that followed, I began focusing on what little information existed about the life the others had lived during their 13 years away. Most of the documents were incomplete or coded, but one entry, buried inside a debrief note labeled Cultural Adaptation Report 03, offered a glimpse into the society they had been sent to observe. The file wasn't long, just a series of observations from an unnamed crew member, likely the same one who had signed previous journal entries as M. This time, though, the tone was different. It was reflective, quieter, as if the writer had stopped trying to understand the environment analytically and instead had begun to absorb it. The entry opened with a description of the Ebon settlements. They were circular in design, clustered in open plains where visibility stretched for miles in every direction. The buildings were low, smooth, and made from a material the crew had never encountered before, soft to the touch, warm in the cold and cool in the heat. According to the writer, these structures were neither manufactured nor grown. The hosts referred to them simply as gifts from the land, suggesting an advanced method of fabrication that wasn't industrial, yet precise. There were no straight lines, no hard edges, and no visible doors. Entryways responded to the presence of the beings who lived there, opening soundlessly and sealing again without leaving a trace. Inside, the crew noted that no one had personal rooms or private property. Every space was shared, every resource communal. There were no markets, no currency, and no apparent concept of trade. The Ebons worked, but their work wasn't assigned. Instead, each individual seemed to know their role, contributing where needed without command or hierarchy. The writer admitted this was the hardest part to understand. Coming from a structured, rank-based system, the crew had expected to meet leaders, technicians, or some kind of chain of authority. But there were none. There was no government in the traditional sense. Decisions were made through what the writer called consensus gatherings, during which members of the community would share thoughts, not as arguments, but as overlapping ideas that gradually shaped into direction. There was no voting, no debate, just a process of convergence. The Ebons didn't lie. The crew learned this quickly, and it unsettled them. Honesty wasn't considered a virtue, it was simply the only way they communicated. There was no sarcasm, no exaggeration, and no evasion. When a question was asked, it was answered directly, often with simple clarity that left little room for interpretation. The concept of deceit was so foreign that the Ebons struggled to understand why the humans would hide certain emotions or hold back truth out of politeness. To them, concealment was confusion, and confusion was suffering. This caused friction in the early days. The crew had arrived with protocols, instructions on how to interact diplomatically, how to observe without influencing, how to protect their own emotional states, but the constant transparency of the Ebons made that impossible. Every thought, left unspoken, became visible through body language or tone, and the hosts, eager to help, would gently ask why the humans were in pain. They didn't see discomfort as weakness. They saw it as a signal to gather and support. Over time, this stripped away the crew's defenses. What began as tension became resignation, and then something closer to understanding. One entry stated, "I no longer feel like I'm being studied. I feel like I'm being included." Another line read, "We are starting to see that they are not superior. They are simply aligned." That word, aligned, was used often in the later entries. It referred to the way the Ebons lived with each other and with their environment. Their society wasn't built on growth or control, it was built on balance. They cultivated food, but only what they needed. They built, but never beyond their ability to maintain. Their energy systems were passive, drawn from ambient sources not yet understood by the crew. There were no weapons, no military, and no locks. The idea of theft had no equivalent in their language. One crew member, according to the logs, struggled with this the most. He had come from a background where security meant control. Seeing a society that operated without fear of loss made him uncomfortable. The notes suggest he withdrew for a period, choosing to live slightly apart from the group. But even then the Ebons continued to offer inclusion, not out of obligation, but because separation made them uneasy. One line from the report read, "They do not allow exclusion to go unnoticed, not because it breaks a rule, but because it breaks a connection." The emotional strain on the crew grew more complex with time. For some, the Ebon way of life was a relief, a kind of peace they hadn't expected. For others, it became unsettling. Without conflict or ambition, they began to feel unanchored. There was nothing to resist, no competition, no reward system. It forced them to confront their own identity, built not on who they were, but on what they did. One journal note stated simply, "Without struggle, who are we?" That question, left unanswered, appeared several more times in later reports. Not all. Crew members felt the same. Some adapted quickly, others grew restless. But even those who embraced the Ebon society admitted to moments of confusion. The simplicity wasn't false, it was complete, and in that completeness they saw the absence of things they had always assumed were necessary. No stories of conquest, no records of war, no desire for expansion. The Ebons had reached a point of cultural stillness, and they saw it as maturity. One crew member, after spending 3 years integrated with the Ebon daily routine, wrote, "They have solved the equation we still write in blood. That sentence stayed with me. It wasn't praise, it wasn't criticism, it was just observation. A moment of quiet truth from someone who had seen a way of life that didn't need walls or weapons to survive. Yet within that peace there was also discomfort. The crew remained outsiders. They were treated with respect, even care, but never truly blended in. Language barriers faded, routines became familiar, but the emotional distance remained. The Ebon Society welcomed guests, but didn't change for them, and for a few crew members, that truth became too heavy. One in particular began to question whether returning to Earth was even the right choice. That thread would become more important later, but in the context of these early reports, it marked the beginning of internal division. The mission had been meant as observation, but what they found was a mirror, and the reflection was not easy to accept. The internal conflict that had begun with quiet discomfort eventually found its pressure point in communication, or more precisely, in the slow unraveling of it. From the beginning, Earth had maintained a scheduled protocol for updates from the crew, based on pre-agreed transmission windows using the device referred to only in the logs as the relay array. It had been provided by the hosts and was designed to sync signals back to Earth through a method not fully understood by the crew. The early transmissions were simple: status updates, environmental reports, crew health summaries, each logged by a designated communicator and confirmed by response pings from the receiving station on Earth. But within the first year, those confirmations began to change. At first, the crew received acknowledgements later than expected, sometimes by hours, sometimes by days. They chalked it up to distance, equipment alignment, or even solar interference. The hosts claimed nothing had changed in the array's function, and the crew had no way to verify that. Over time, the delays grew longer. Messages sent during scheduled windows received no replies. Others returned garbled or incomplete. Earth's responses, when they came, began to seem out of sync with what the crew had written, as if time itself had begun to desynchronize between the two worlds. One transmission from Earth referenced a message the crew hadn't sent yet. Another acknowledged a question never asked. At first, the crew believed it was a technical failure, but after a year, the communicator's logs began to note something else. He wrote, "We are starting to suspect the issue is not mechanical. There may be a difference in time perception, not just passage. Our clocks show consistent intervals. Our instruments confirm steady conditions, but the delay is increasing without cause." This possibility, time itself functioning differently, introduced a new kind of uncertainty. The crew had expected minor distortions, even some drift in subjective perception, but they hadn't prepared for total asynchrony. After 15 months, only 1 in every 5 transmissions received a reply. Earth's messages were shorter, less detailed, and increasingly generic. They offered no updates from home, no direct questions, and eventually stopped addressing individual crew members by name. The logs began to express concern. One stated, "We don't know if anyone is receiving these anymore. If they are, we don't know how long it takes to reach them, or what year it is when they do." That single sentence marked a turning point. Until then, the mission had operated under the assumption that contact, while limited, was reliable. After that entry, it became clear the crew was beginning to feel alone. The psychological impact became visible in later reports. The team split. Their time between structured observation tasks and attempts to maintain their own schedules, but without regular feedback from Earth, their framework started to drift. Days blended, roles blurred, even though they were still receiving full support. From the hosts, the absence of response from home created a gap no amount of comfort could fill. They had been trained to endure separation, not silence. One crew member, whose entries were always brief and clinical, wrote simply, "It's hard to care what we learn if no one will ever hear it." Another, more emotional, wrote, "Sometimes I say things out loud just to feel like they still exist." The crew made attempts to restore a sense of rhythm. They created new rituals, weekly shared meals, discussion circles, even mock holidays based on Earth calendars. The hosts accommodated them, but didn't fully understand the purpose. They offered their own cycles tied to environmental changes the humans couldn't perceive, minor shifts in sunlight tone, magnetic pulses, or subtle vibrations in the atmosphere. The crew tried to follow, but it never felt natural. They were living in a world where even time seemed foreign. Eventually, the communicator stopped logging transmission attempts entirely. His final entry on the subject read, "Array functioning nominally. Transmission complete. No further responses recorded. We will continue until instructed otherwise." After that, there was nothing. No more updates about signal strength, no mention of Earth's pings. It was as if the crew had made peace with the possibility that their words were falling into nothing. That shift had consequences. Without feedback, the crew no longer adjusted their approach to new information. Reports became less frequent, observations more personal. The group's focus turned inward. They still worked, still interacted with the hosts, but something changed in their tone. One entry reflected this clearly. "We are no longer working for Earth. We are simply trying to remember who we were when we left." That realization marked the beginning of the mission's second phase, not defined by exploration, but by survival of identity. They were surrounded by peace, supported by beings who offered no threat. Yet isolation began to wear on them more deeply than they had imagined. Earth had become distant not just in space, but in time and relevance. And without that connection, the meaning of the mission itself began to blur. One crew member, previously regarded as stable and composed, began referring to Earth in the past tense. Others corrected him at first, then stopped. Eventually, a new kind of routine emerged. The logs mentioned fewer meetings, fewer reports. The entries focused more on memory, recalling family, trying to reconstruct details about places, voices, smells. Some began writing letters they knew would never be sent. Others withdrew into silence. Even among the Ebons who continued to offer comfort and inclusion, the crew's sense of purpose was fading. The journal entries became shorter, more symbolic. One consisted of a single line. "Daylight again. Still here? Still waiting." That note became a kind of marker. It appeared multiple times, written by different hands. A quiet signal of endurance, and perhaps resignation. The breakdown in communication hadn't just cut the crew off from home. It had severed their reason for being there. What had begun as a historic exchange was now a suspended existence, living witnesses to something no one might ever come back to explain, and that weight, more than the distance, was what changed them. The silence from Earth had left more than just a gap in communication. It had created a vacuum in purpose, and into that vacuum, division began to grow. For nearly 2 years after the last confirmed transmission, the crew tried to maintain unity. They followed routines, supported each other, and adapted as best they could. But slowly, without anyone noticing at first, small differences began to surface. It started with shifts in language. Some members began using Eben terms more often than English. They adopted the host's expressions for time, emotion, and location. Others resisted, clinging to their Earth-based frameworks, insisting on tracking their own calendars, even when they no longer aligned with the world around them. These differences were subtle, but they marked a deeper split between those who saw the mission as temporary and those who had begun to question whether returning home was even possible. The tension remained unspoken until one crew member, a systems engineer by training and one of the earliest to embrace the Eben way of life, asked a question during a group meeting that no one had dared to voice out loud. He asked, calmly and without provocation, "What if we stayed?" The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. It wasn't the idea itself that shocked the group, it was that someone had finally said it. For some, the suggestion was betrayal. They had been chosen for a purpose, trained to represent their people, and expected to return with knowledge. Staying would mean abandoning that responsibility. For others, it was a practical question. With no clear path home and no confirmation of continued contact, what exactly were they waiting for? If Earth no longer listened or no longer existed, what duty remained? The divide became clearer in the weeks that followed. A group of 4 began spending more time with the hosts, participating in their gatherings, even sleeping in shared spaces rather than the crew quarters. They spoke Eben fluently and expressed a growing comfort with the simplicity of the culture. They no longer recorded logs, stating that Earth was no longer the audience they needed to speak to. Another group, smaller but more rigid, clung to the structure of the original mission. They kept schedules, ran diagnostics on the relay array, and insisted on maintaining the chain of command, even as authority faded into habit. The rest of the crew, caught between these two poles, simply endured. They rotated between both groups, trying to avoid confrontation while managing their own quiet uncertainties. The journals from this period became more fragmented. Entries referenced long walks alone, internal doubts, and a recurring dream in which Earth appeared only as a shadow, visible but unreachable. One log, unsigned, described the feeling as being tethered to something that is no longer there, but still pulling you back. Despite the tension, no one became hostile. The division wasn't aggressive, it was emotional. It expressed itself in silence, avoidance, and a growing reluctance to engage in shared decisions. Meals became quieter. Work became solitary. The cohesion that had once defined their survival began to thin. The Ebens noticed, though they said little. Instead, they increased their presence near the crew quarters, offering quiet gestures of inclusion, responding to emotional cues rather than words. But even this began to create new stress. Some crew members resented the attention, seeing it as interference. Others welcomed it, seeing the hosts as their only remaining connection to stability. The turning point came when one member, one who had always been quiet, observant, and deeply affected by the loss of communication, left without warning. According to the logs, he had last been seen walking beyond the settlement perimeter, following a route the crew used for routine atmospheric sampling. He didn't return. Search efforts began immediately. The Ebens, joined without hesitation, scanning the terrain with methods the crew didn't fully understand. For 3 days, the group combed the surrounding areas. No signs of distress were found, no evidence of struggle, just a single item left behind, a journal placed carefully on a flat stone, open to a final entry that read, "I need to see something that isn't given. I need to know if I still choose this." The search was eventually called off. The crew returned, unsettled but silent. No one asked questions, no one assigned blame. But the disappearance changed the group in a way nothing else had. It became clear that the decision to stay or leave wasn't theoretical anymore. It was becoming real. The idea that one of them had chosen to leave, even if not permanently, without discussion, without approval, broke the unspoken agreement that had kept them together. The entries after this moment were filled with quiet resignation. One stated, "We are not 12 anymore, not in purpose, not in thought." Another said, "I no longer know if I would go home if given the chance, and I no longer know if that matters." The original mission goals, carefully written and agreed upon years before, had become irrelevant. The return protocols, the data reports, the sample logs, all still maintained by a few, felt more like ritual than science. What had once been a shared objective was now a collection of private reasons to continue, each crew member holding on to their own version of the story. The Ebons remained consistent, never changing in behavior, never withdrawing their support. But their patience seemed infinite, and in that infinite patience the crew began to see something they hadn't expected. A mirror, not of who they were, but of what they could no longer pretend to be. The unity that had defined them was gone, not with a fight, but with distance. And in that quiet fracture, the mission shifted once again. Not in what it sought to discover, but in what it had already revealed. The split in the crew had remained quiet, an unspoken separation that shaped daily life without erupting into conflict. But no system remains in balance forever, and eventually the fragile line between discontent and defiance was crossed. It began with a decision made by one crew member without approval, discussion, or warning, a single act that changed the course of the mission more than any technical failure or external challenge. According to the logs, the individual had been one of the original engineers tasked with maintaining the relay array, the same array that had long since stopped receiving responses from Earth. Over time, he had grown quiet, withdrawn, and skeptical of the explanations given by both the crew and the hosts. He believed the breakdown in communication was not an accident, not the result of distance or environmental variables, but an intentional restriction. He thought someone, either among the crew or within the Ebon structure, was filtering the signals, choosing what was allowed through and what was not. His suspicion had been written in small notations in his personal journal, observations that in retrospect seemed paranoid but were grounded in his own growing frustration. Then, without announcement, he reactivated a backup channel embedded deep within the relay array's framework. This channel had been disabled during training as a safeguard, a direct uplink bypassing the host interface. It was not part of the agreed protocol, and using it was a violation of mission rules. But he did it anyway, transmitting a coded message across an untested frequency aimed at a classified receiving point on Earth that, as far as anyone knew, had not been active for years. The message itself was brief, a report of silence, an accusation of sabotage, and a request for immediate extraction. It was a desperate signal sent without clearance, and most importantly, without the knowledge of the rest of the crew. The consequences arrived not in the form of punishment or confrontation, but in something far stranger. Within days, the host behavior began to shift. Nothing overt, no accusations, but subtle changes appeared. The hosts became more present during the crew's private time. Their invitations to gatherings increased in frequency. Observation drones, once passive and discreet, became more visible, following the crew at closer range. The atmosphere around the mission changed, not with hostility, but with something more difficult to define, a quiet scrutiny, as if the hosts had become aware of a fracture they could not explain. The crew noticed. The divide, once manageable, deepened. Tensions rose, trust thinned. When the unauthorized message was discovered, triggered by a diagnostic scan on the relay interface, a confrontation became unavoidable. A senior team member confronted the engineer not in anger, but with the quiet disappointment of someone forced to acknowledge a line had been crossed. The engineer did not deny what he had done. He defended it. He said the silence had become a lie, that waiting for Earth to respond was no longer an act of duty, but of denial. He claimed the mission had already failed, and that sending the message was the only way to force the truth into the open. The others disagreed, some with quiet frustration, others with sharp, clear anger. Not because he had sent the message, but because he had done it alone. The breach wasn't just technical, it was personal. It fractured the last layer of unity the crew had. One journal entry from this period read, "We were already breaking apart." He just gave it shape. The hosts never addressed the message directly, but their response became unmistakable. A full day after the transmission, 2 Ebons visited the crew's quarters carrying an object the humans had never seen before, a smooth, metallic disc, no larger than a dinner plate, emitting a low, rhythmic pulse. They placed it in the center of the room and left without explanation. The crew examined it. It emitted no heat, no radio signal, no visible reaction to touch. But one crew member, a linguistic specialist who had grown skilled in interpreting the host's symbolic communication, believed it represented a warning. The pulse pattern, she noted, matched a visual rhythm the hosts used to mark limits, areas beyond which guests were not permitted, places where balance had to be preserved. She interpreted it as a message. Boundaries had been crossed. The device remained in the room for 6 days before being retrieved. During that time, the crew's activities were closely monitored. The hosts offered no changes in tone or support, but the illusion of ease was gone. The engineer who had sent the message withdrew even further, no longer participating in shared tasks or discussions. He remained isolated, watched but not punished, his presence tolerated but no longer trusted. The journals from this period became darker. One stated, "We are no longer seen as visitors, we are now an experiment under stress." Another noted the mistake was not the message. It was forgetting that we were not alone. The breach had not only altered the mission status, it had revealed something deeper about the nature of the exchange. The hosts had allowed the humans to operate with autonomy, but only within a framework of trust. That trust had been broken, and while no consequences were imposed, the distance that followed was more effective than punishment. The crew, once unsure of the host's emotional depth, now saw clearly that boundaries existed, not enforced by power, but maintained through quiet, unwavering expectation. They were not prisoners, but neither were they equals. They were guests, and one of them had violated the terms of that invitation. The weight of that choice lingered. No further transmissions were attempted. The relay array was locked down, and the engineer was relieved of all technical duties. He did not resist. In his final journal entry, he wrote, "I didn't do it for me. I did it because no one else would admit we've been forgotten." He signed it with his full name, the only crew member in the entire archive to do so. That signature was later redacted in the official summary, replaced with an anonymous code, but I found a fragment of it buried in an older version of the file, missed during revision. I won't repeat it here. His identity is less important than the truth of his action. In breaking the silence, he had hoped to be heard. Instead, he reminded everyone just how far from home they really were. The decision to send the unauthorized transmission had fractured the crew's unity, but it also brought a question to the surface that none of them could ignore any longer: when or if they would return home. It had been years since they last received a clear response from Earth, and although the mission timeline had always projected a return after 13 Earth years, the silence had made that expectation feel uncertain. The hosts had never confirmed the return date. They had acknowledged the plan but treated it with polite distance, never offering specifics, never initiating the subject. Now, as the mission moved past its halfway point, the crew could no longer avoid addressing the question directly. According to the surviving journal logs, the conversation began as a formal proposal written by the mission commander and signed by 6 of the remaining members. It requested confirmation of the departure timeline and asked for the logistical steps needed to begin preparations for the journey back. The message was translated and delivered through the standard communication protocol the crew had used to exchange updates with the hosts. There was no urgency in the wording. The tone was respectful, calm, procedural. But beneath the formality was a clear intent. They wanted to go home. The response came 3 Earth days later, delivered through one of the host's designated mediators. The reply was brief and without emotion. The hosts acknowledged the request, stated that conditions were currently not safe for return, and advised that the discussion be delayed until a later time. No further explanation was given. The crew reacted with a mix of frustration and quiet disbelief. They had expected cooperation, maybe even support. Instead, they received what felt like a deferral, polite, non-committal, and final. The phrase "not safe for return" became a focal point of debate. What did it mean? Unsafe because of planetary conditions, technological limitations, or something else? The journals show that several crew members believed the hosts were being deliberately vague. Others suggested the message implied a change in the original agreement. One log stated, "We are no longer sure if the return is delayed, denied, or forgotten." The crew requested clarification. This time, the hosts offered none. Days passed, then weeks. The matter was not raised again by the hosts, and the crew received no further response to follow-up inquiries. The silence that followed was louder than any denial. It signaled something deeper, a shift in the relationship that none of them had expected. The hosts, once open and responsive, had drawn a line. They would not stop the humans from preparing, but they would not help either. Supplies were still provided, interactions remained courteous, but the atmosphere had changed. What had once felt like shared experience now felt like tolerated presence. The crew divided again, this time along new lines. Some believed the hosts had always intended to keep them there, that the mission had been designed as a one-way trip disguised as an exchange. Others held on to the idea that conditions truly had changed and that the hosts were simply being cautious. The difference between belief and suspicion widened with each passing day. In one log, a crew member wrote, "They speak in circles, always polite, always smiling, but something is being withheld, and we are no longer part of the discussion." That sentiment grew over time. The crew, already weakened by years of separation and internal strain, now faced the possibility that their return was not guaranteed. The engineer who had sent the unauthorized message remained silent. He did not speak during meetings, did not contribute to discussions about the request. He stayed apart, his earlier defiance now folded into the larger uncertainty. The commander, still trying to preserve a sense of structure, instructed the team to begin independent preparations for return anyway. They inventoried their supplies, recalibrated the systems left dormant in the landing site, and attempted to simulate departure sequences using the alien interface. But the hosts did not assist. They observed, silently and without interference, offering no guidance, no warnings, and no acknowledgement of the crew's efforts. The lack of resistance was worse than confrontation. It felt like indifference. One entry recorded during this phase noted, "They are letting us try, but they are not helping us succeed." The psychological toll deepened. The hope of return had sustained many of them through the most difficult periods. Without it, even routine tasks lost meaning. One crew member, once methodical and precise, stopped recording logs altogether. Another began to refer to Earth only as a past experience, something remembered but no longer relevant. The finality of that mindset began to spread. The belief that they might never leave took root quietly, not as panic, but as fatigue. The mission had transformed again. It was no longer about observation or exchange. It had become a study in adaptation, how long a person could remain functional in a place where nothing was familiar and no endpoint was certain. The hosts continued their support without change. Their systems still worked. Their supplies never failed. They remained calm, consistent, and distant. The more the crew tried to reassert control, the more evident it became that the power to leave was not in their hands. A final attempt was made. A second proposal, written with even more clarity, asked not for assistance, but for permission. It stated plainly that the crew was preparing to return and requested only one answer, yes or no. The reply came the next day. It was the same. Conditions are not safe. Departure is not recommended at this time. That was the last time the topic of return appeared in the host communications. After that, they spoke only of the present, daily needs, environmental observations, technical maintenance. The concept of departure, it seemed, was no longer open for discussion. The crew accepted it in silence. There were no arguments, no rebellion. Just the quiet work of people who had run out of options. One log captured the feeling in a single line, "We are still here." And now we know what that means. The refusal to approve the crew's return had created a quiet resignation among them, a sense that their fate was no longer theirs to decide. The logs from this period became shorter, less frequent, and filled with fragmented thoughts rather than structured reports. But buried within the final sequence of transmissions archived in the surviving debrief materials, I found a set of internal notes that hinted at something larger, something that had not been shared with the crew at the time. These documents were not written by the crew or the hosts, but by an administrative figure within the mission's original planning committee. The file had been mislabeled under a logistics heading and included in a batch of scanned physical documents tied to early mission preparation. Most of the contents were routine, checklists, personnel assignments, and scheduled drafts. But at the end of the file, there was a short, handwritten memorandum marked for committee use only. It outlined a contingency protocol labeled Selective Continuance. According to the memo, this protocol was not part of the public-facing mission structure. It had been reviewed and approved only at the highest level, under the authority of a joint oversight panel that no longer officially existed. The memo stated that if communication breakdown occurred and safe return could not be verified, the hosts had agreed to retain a portion of the crew indefinitely. The language was cautious but clear. In the event return is deemed unsafe or otherwise unfeasible, no fewer than 4 personnel shall remain for purposes of extended cultural liaison and specimen continuity. The word specimen was crossed out in ink and replaced with representative, but the original wording revealed more than intended. The existence of this agreement meant the possibility of a one-way mission had not only been anticipated, but planned. It also explained the hosts' reaction to the request for departure. They were not denying a promise, they were fulfilling a condition. I checked the timeline. The memo had been dated 6 months before the crew's departure. It was not a reaction to failure, but a built-in clause. The decision had been made before the mission ever left Earth. None of the crew had mentioned this in their journals. None of the logs referenced any awareness of this protocol. That meant they had not been told. The planners had decided that the crew should believe they were all meant to return, even as they prepared to leave some behind. It was a psychological tactic, one designed to preserve morale and prevent resistance. But it also meant the trust placed in the mission had been false from the beginning. I cross-referenced the document with return logs from the later phase of the mission and found another clue. A post-return analysis written by a medical officer during the Earthside debriefing of the 8 who eventually made it home noted that 2 of the returned personnel showed signs of emotional conflict relating to voluntary division of the crew. That phrase, voluntary division, matched the internal language of the earlier memo. It confirmed that the split had happened with partial consent, but that consent had not been fully informed. I pieced together what had happened. As the planned return date approached, the crew must have been told, quietly, and likely without detail, that only some of them would be coming back. The others would remain, not as prisoners, but as part of the continued relationship between species. The crew had always known they were there for observation and exchange, but they had not understood the full terms of that exchange. 4 were selected. 2 had reportedly chosen to stay. Whether the other 2 stayed willingly or not was never clarified. Their names were not included in the final summaries, and no confirmation of their survival was provided beyond a line in a separate report stating, "Remaining personnel adjusted to permanent settlement protocols with assistance from host society." The detail was buried beneath discussions of resource management and return logistics. It was mentioned only once. That omission was not accidental. It was a way to acknowledge what happened without allowing it to become part of the official record. The deception was not in the fact that some had remained. It was in pretending all had the same choice. One log, written by a returned crew member and later leaked during a classified audit, captured the emotion of that moment with devastating simplicity. "We didn't know until the last night. They brought the departure roster and told us not. Everyone would go. They said it was for the greater good. We didn't argue. We didn't even cry. We just sat there. No one moved." And that quiet moment, that forced acceptance, said more than any formal statement ever could. It revealed the cost of the mission, not in blood, not in failure, but in trust. Those who returned were not the same. Their medical reports showed elevated stress markers, sleep disturbances, and signs of dissociation. Their interviews were brief, controlled, and heavily redacted. The few documents that survived noted that integration back into Earth society proved challenging for several of them, and that 2 were placed into long-term psychological support within undisclosed facilities. The official story framed the mission as a limited success. It praised the peaceful exchange, the scientific breakthroughs, the cooperation. But beneath that polished narrative was the truth. 8 returned. 4 remained. 2 had died, and all of them had been part of an agreement made in secret, justified as necessity, and hidden behind a story that never truly belonged to them. The hidden agreement was not just a legal document. It was a decision about what a human life could be traded for, a trade made not by those who travelled, but by those who stayed behind. The return of the 8 surviving crew members took place in August of 1978, 13 years and 1 month after their departure, but almost nothing about their arrival was made public. There were no headlines, no ceremonies, and no records placed in official logs. According to the internal documents I reviewed, the landing occurred in a remote area of the Nevada Test and Training Range, far from any civilian visibility. The craft itself was described as nearly identical to the one that had transported them in 1965, though it arrived with no prior warning. Ground teams were alerted by a coded transmission received 3 hours before touchdown. Only those with that prior clearance were allowed within a 5-mile radius of the site. The arrival was quiet, controlled, and carried out under near total silence. Medical teams in sealed suits received the crew and performed immediate scans before transferring them to an underground facility nearby. The files recorded no injuries, no illness, and no signs of physical trauma. On paper, the mission was a success. 8 humans had left Earth, lived among a non-human society for over a decade, and returned with no outward harm. But the documents told a different story. Psychological assessments began within hours of landing, and the initial reports used clinical language to mask what was clear between the lines. Something was wrong. The returning crew members exhibited patterns of disassociation, lapses in memory, emotional detachment, and altered behavioral responses. Their speech was slowed, their body language was subdued. Most answered questions without emotion or elaboration. One refused to speak for the first 72 hours. Another reportedly asked to be taken back. The medical report stated that these behaviors were within expected parameters given extended alien exposure, but the language felt forced, as though it was written to justify something no one wanted to admit. The debriefings were recorded, but almost all transcripts were sealed within weeks, with only fragments surviving in internal summaries. One excerpt described a moment when a crew member was asked to recount the mission's midpoint. He paused, stared at the floor and said, "We thought we knew what time was, but we were wrong. It changes you." That sentence appeared in multiple reports repeated by at least 3 of the 8, almost word for word. Whether it was a shared memory, a phrase adopted from their hosts, or a sign of deeper psychological alteration remained unclear. The official post-mission summary, labelled Operation Closure, stated that the crew had been exposed to a non-Earth chronological environment and that the long-term neurological impacts were still under evaluation. But the truth became clear in the follow-up documentation. Within 6 months, all 8 individuals had been relocated to classified care facilities. Their families were informed that they had returned from long-term deployment and would require ongoing treatment. The nature of their mission was never disclosed. Publicly, they were either retired or transferred to quiet administrative roles. In reality, they vanished again, this time into Earth's own system of shadows. One was moved to a secured wing of a military medical center in the Pacific Northwest. Another to a remote intelligence compound in New Mexico. Of the remaining 6, only 2 were placed in facilities with open psychological records, and those records ended abruptly in 1981. The rest had no further traceable documentation. I found a single update filed in 1983 marked Continuing Observation. It referred to behavioral consistency, controlled stimuli exposure, and reintegration potential minimal. That phrase, reintegration potential, revealed more than the entire report. It confirmed that for the returning crew, Earth was no longer the world they had left. Physically, they had come home. Mentally, emotionally, and perhaps biologically, they had not. The only insight into their inner experience came from a single personal note, written by one of the 8 and discovered during a later archive review. The note had been handwritten, unsigned, and misfiled in a batch of general psychological assessments. It read, "I remember the light there. It never changed. It didn't rise or fall, it just was. Constant like the way they looked at us, never judging, never afraid. Coming back here I didn't feel the same weight. I felt smaller, not because of what I lost, but because of what I knew I couldn't explain." That note was never referenced in any official review. It was filed, scanned, and ignored. The author was not identified, but the handwriting matched entries from one of the mission's original cultural liaisons. That individual had been responsible for documenting the emotional and social differences between the crew and the hosts. According to the mission log, he had been one of the most stable participants throughout the exchange. After returning, he disappeared into a secured care center and was never seen in public again. The silence surrounding the return was not accidental. It had been planned from the start. The hidden agreement had made clear that secrecy was essential to the program's survival. The only acceptable outcome was a quiet reintegration, or failing that, total containment. The files made no mention of dissemination, public education, or policy recommendations. The knowledge gained was never intended to inform the world. It was meant to remain under lock and key, accessible only to those already convinced of its necessity. The returned crew, despite everything they had witnessed, were not treated as heroes or pioneers. They were treated as liabilities, living evidence of an encounter too complex, too destabilizing to be shared. Their data was harvested, their memories dissected, their lives redirected into corridors without exit. One final note appeared in a classified memorandum dated 1986, summarizing the long-term outcome of the Serpo mission. It read, "Primary objectives complete. Secondary integration suspended indefinitely. Remaining subjects stable but unsuitable. For dissemination efforts, recommend continued observation under limited interface." That was the last official record I found. After that, the paper trail ended. No more updates, no closure, no acknowledgement. The 8 who came back were erased again, this time not across stars, but within the files of the world they had once served. Their story was not preserved, it was buried. The silence that followed the crew's return was not a reaction, it was a strategy. Everything about the aftermath of Project Serpo was shaped by deliberate omission, calculated denial, and the quiet erasure of truth through layers of plausible fiction. The 8 who came back disappeared into controlled facilities, their names scrubbed from records and their existence reduced to vague administrative codes. But the real cover-up wasn't what happened to them. It was what was done with what they brought back. In the months following their reintegration, classified departments across 3 agencies initiated what was called the Vault Project, a coordinated effort to contain, sanitize, and suppress all knowledge related to the mission. The documents I found from that phase weren't marked Serpo. Instead, they appeared under headings like Contingency Analysis, Advanced Behavioral Drift Studies, and Non-Standard Cognitive Recovery. These files were fragmented, and often disguised within broader reports, but together they outlined a system built to erase without destroying. Evidence was not hidden, it was discredited. Technical data recovered from the mission was rerouted through think tanks and civilian contractors, stripped of origin, and leaked into academic research under unrelated grants. Environmental observations were buried inside obscure atmospheric studies. Biological samples were either mislabeled or absorbed into unrelated military medical archives, and most critically, the personal accounts of the crew were diluted through repetition, skepticism, and public noise. One report outlined the use of controlled disinformation campaigns. These included false leaks, contradictory stories, and anonymous, insider testimonies designed to flood early forums and publications with confusion. The idea wasn't to hide the story, it was to make it impossible to prove. This method worked. By the early 2000s, Serpo had become little more than an internet rumor, a fringe theory debated in forgotten threads. The truth had not been silenced. It had been buried beneath so many lies that even those who wanted to believe couldn't find footing. The media played its part, sometimes knowingly, often without realizing it. Early inquiries were dismissed, journalists were redirected, and mainstream coverage painted the story as just another Cold War myth. By the time the emails surfaced in 2005, most official sources had already been scrubbed. Researchers found themselves running in circles, names led to dead ends, documents had gaps, and every answer created 2 more questions. I know this because I ran those circles for years, and yet traces remained. The truth, buried carefully, still left seams. One of the clearest came from a document found in a misfiled FOIA response, an interagency memo discussing reputation control protocols for personnel linked to unverified extraterrestrial cooperative exercises. The memo outlined strategies for neutralizing inquiry, including the use of psychological profiling to discredit individuals showing obsessive interest in the topic. The suggestion was simple: paint them as unstable, isolate their findings with disclaimers, cast doubt not on the evidence but on the person presenting it. This strategy explained why so many early whistleblowers had faded into obscurity. Their credibility wasn't attacked directly, it was dissolved slowly through subtle language, vague accusations, and a few well-timed career disruptions. One note in the memo read, "If they doubt themselves, the public will follow." The cover-up was not just institutional, it became cultural. It taught us to mock certain ideas before we understood them, to laugh at the impossible rather than examine it. That reflex became the strongest defense the truth ever had. The Serpo files were still there, scattered in pieces, hiding in plain sight. But even those who found them rarely believed what they were seeing. And those who did believe quickly realized no one would listen. The final layer of the cover-up was time. As decades passed, even the people who had been involved began to forget, either by design or because memory itself had softened. Some had died, others had faded into retirement, carrying pieces of the story they no longer had reason to tell. A few had tried to speak, only to be ignored, ridiculed, or overwhelmed by louder voices offering simpler explanations. By the time I started my research, most of what remained were echoes, scanned documents, old logs, fragments of interviews. But even those were enough to understand that what had happened was real, enough to see that silence had been manufactured, not earned, enough to know that every doubt I'd once had was part of the system designed to keep people like me from looking too closely. In one of the last reports I reviewed, there was a sentence that stood out from the technical language surrounding it. It said, "No further action required, containment complete." It was a final statement, written without urgency, as if closing a file that would never be opened again. But the sentence was wrong. Containment was never complete. It only worked, as long as no one went looking. And I had gone looking. Everything I found pointed to a single truth. Serpo wasn't hidden in the dark. It was hidden in plain sight, surrounded by noise, distraction, and just enough uncertainty to make the truth feel like fiction. The greatest cover-up wasn't about what they did, it was about making sure no one believed they did it at all. It took years to find him. By the time I traced the last living member of the Serpo mission, he was already far removed from the world that had once sent him across the stars. His name, heavily redacted in every document, finally appeared in an obscure veterans' medical index under a pseudonym used for psychological care cases. The listing gave only a first initial and a facility code, but it was enough. The location was rural, tucked into the edge of a wooded region in the northern Midwest, far from cities, reporters, or curious researchers. The building was simple, institutional in design, and guarded not by security but by obscurity. He wasn't hidden by force, he was hidden by time and neglect. When I requested a visit, I was told he no longer accepted interviews. I left my name and a short letter with the facility director. I didn't expect a response. 3 weeks later, I received a call from an unlisted number. A voice, calm but aged, asked me a single question. "Why are you still looking?" I answered truthfully. I said I wanted to understand what had been buried. There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Come quietly, no recordings, no promises." I agreed. The man I met had once been a military officer, lean and focused in the few photographs that survived the program's erasure. Now he sat hunched, frail, his skin pale, his eyes deeply set, but his presence was sharp. He hadn't forgotten, he hadn't faded, he had simply stepped out of reach. For a long time he said nothing. He studied me with the kind of caution that comes from knowing how far truth can fall. When he finally spoke, his words were slow and clear. They told us we'd be remembered. They told us it mattered. He looked past me, as if seeing something farther away than I could follow. But when we came back, there was nothing to come back to. People had moved on, the world had changed, and we hadn't. I asked him what the hardest part had been. He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Not the waiting, not the time. It was the silence. 13 years of trying to stay human when no one could tell you what that meant anymore." I asked if the hosts had kept their word. If they had, treated the crew with respect. He nodded. They were patient. Always patient. They didn't lie, they didn't control us, but they didn't save us either. We were there to observe, and eventually we understood that we were also being observed. His voice was steady, without bitterness. I asked him about the 4 who stayed behind. He closed his eyes for a moment. 2 volunteered. The others didn't argue. We all knew what the agreement was, even if no one said it aloud. I asked if he had wanted to stay. He took a long breath. I thought about it. Some of us had already become part of that place. We were used to it. The stillness, the way time bent. Earth felt like an old photo, faded, familiar, but no longer real. I asked why he chose to return. He said, "Because someone had to remember." He stood slowly, walked to a drawer, and pulled out a single item, a folded page, yellowed at the edges. It was a list, handwritten. Names, not full names, just first initials, followed by mission roles. Next to 4 of them, a small mark, a circle. "Those were the ones meant to stay," he said. "But it didn't matter in the end. We all stayed in some way." I asked him what he wanted people to know. He looked at me carefully. "Not everything," he said. "Not the technical pieces, not the dates, that's not the point." He pointed to the paper again. "This is what matters. That we were real, that we went, that we weren't alone." I asked him if he believed contact would ever be made openly. He shook his head. "Not like that. Not until we understand the cost." We kept asking what they wanted from us. But the real question was whether we ever deserved to ask. I didn't press him further. He had said enough. As I stood to leave, he said one last thing, almost as an afterthought. "They're not done with us yet." The way he said it, calm, without fear or warning, made the room feel colder. I left in silence, the list folded carefully in my pocket. I never heard from him again. Months later, I learned he had passed away quietly. No obituary, no funeral, just a note in the facility, ledger, transferred to off-site status. That was the phrase used in the old Serpo files when someone left the known system. It didn't mean death, it meant absence, intentional, final. I sat with his words for a long time, not because they revealed something new, but because they confirmed everything I had suspected. The mission had happened, the crew had returned, and one by one they had been removed, not for what they knew, but for what their presence reminded others of. That the truth had once stood in front of us, that we had touched it, and then we walked away from it. The last survivor didn't break the silence. He illuminated it, and in that silence I found the shape of everything we had lost. After speaking with the last survivor and collecting everything I could from records, transcripts, misfiled memos, and handwritten notes, I was left with a decision. It was never stated outright, but the weight of it settled into place the more I pieced the story together. I had everything necessary to publish the truth, or at least what remained of it. Not a theory, not a myth, but a quiet, comprehensive account of a secret the world had chosen to forget. I knew the consequences. Releasing this information wouldn't cause panic or immediate change. It would cause something slower, resistance, dismissal, attempts to discredit, and possibly quiet forms of retaliation. The very methods used to bury Serpo would be used again, only this time aimed at me. I had no illusions of glory or vindication. I knew how stories like this ended. Not with answers, but with more silence. Still, I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I had walked the trail from the moment of contact to the last breath of the man who tried to preserve it. I had seen how a mission designed as an exchange turned into an unspoken exile. I had seen how the people who came back were erased, not violently, but completely, as if their memories were too heavy for the world to carry. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to force disclosure. I just wanted the story to exist somewhere outside the classified walls that had held it for so long. But even that felt dangerous. In my final review of the documents, I returned to a note I had overlooked before. It was short, unsigned, and placed at the bottom of a larger internal directive on information containment. It read, "If this ever resurfaces, make sure it's treated as fiction." That sentence was the perfect seal on the operation. It didn't deny what had happened. It didn't call it false. It simply directed the world to laugh when it was heard. That's how truth dies, not with fire, but with ridicule. That note became my final proof. They didn't fear exposure. They feared belief. And so I did what I had to. I compiled everything into one archive. I used neutral language, careful tone, and removed anything that could put others at risk. I included the handwritten lists, the debriefing fragments, the reports no one noticed, and the quiet observations that spoke louder than anything official ever had. I locked it behind encryption, stored it on a secure server, and gave access to 3 people I trusted. No more, no media push, no public announcement, just placement, quiet like the story itself. Something to be found only by those already asking the right questions. I didn't hide the file, but I didn't light a path to it either. I let it sit, waiting for time to do what time always does, wear down doubt. Then I stepped back. I let the story breathe on its own. In the weeks that followed, nothing happened. No threats, no visits, no warnings. It was as if the system had already moved on, content that its containment strategy had worked so well it didn't need to act. And maybe that was the real end. Not a confrontation, but an echo, fading without disruption. Yet something lingered. the words of the last survivor repeated in my mind. "They're not done with us yet." I didn't know what he meant. He hadn't explained. But as I replayed the interviews, the logs, the notes, I began to understand what he might have been pointing to. The hosts never ended the exchange, they simply shifted its terms. The mission was never closed, it was paused. Our side went silent, theirs did not. And now, years later, long after the program had been erased, people were still seeing things they couldn't explain, patterns in the sky, quiet signals, dreams that didn't feel like dreams. I didn't believe in fantasy. I still don't, but I believe in memory. And I believe that memory, when denied, finds its way back through other means. Maybe that's all Serpo was in the end. A memory of what we once touched, buried deep enough that even those who protected it had started to forget. But it was real. And it mattered. Not because of the science or the discovery or even the secrecy. It mattered because 12 people left this world carrying the trust of a planet, and only 8 returned. The rest became part of something larger, and no matter how well the story was buried, their silence became a monument. You may not find their names, you may not see their faces, but if you've read this far, if you've followed their path even halfway, then part of their truth now lives in you. That's the only thing that matters now, not proof, not validation, just the quiet, steady knowledge that something extraordinary happened, and that we, for reasons still unclear, chose to forget. But forgetting doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means we left the truth behind, and maybe, in time, we'll be ready to carry it again.